public policy making in Ghana was largely confined to the bureaucrats, hiding within the thick walls of government institutions and deliberating among themselves on what to do because they were considered as the technocrats. The question is, what was their view of the public at the time? The view of elected officials and bureaucrats at the time, as far as the public was concerned, was that the public was a problem and they needed to find solutions to solve the problem. The World Bank's version of knowledge in 1998 was that the public is actually not a problem. The public could potentially be part of the solution. So rather than seeing the public as part of the problem, let's consult them. Technically, part of the idea is let's give people a sense of ownership of policy content. Because if people are the beneficiaries of public policy, or if people are if ordinary citizens are those who are going to be directly or indirectly affected by public policy, to some extent they should have a sense of anticipation. And that sense of anticipation is more likely to emerge when they are involved in some form of discourse or dialogue at the stage of decision making. The ripple effect of that for many countries, including Ghana, is the emergence of what we could now call civil society. All kinds of NGOs emerged, think tanks, we can talk about IEA, SIPA, Imani, all groups emerged that were largely encouraged also by the transnational policy actors like the World Bank, the ILO, the WHO, and all kinds of global institutions that broadly form part of what is often called the epistemic communities, the knowledge communities. What then happened really is that the terrain of public policy making has changed. There was some breakthrough. The silos of the bureaucracies were broken through. And so that's one thing that happened. The second thing that happened also is that the arena of public policy making had also shifted from the bureaucracies to sometimes unconventional centers like focus groups, meetings. Some policies were made by consulting citizens, like the way, let's say, the constitutional review is going about it now. Traditionally, that is not how policy was made in Ghana. The recent reform of the pension system was also based on consulting widely. Traditionally, this is not how things were done in Ghana. The question is, why did we get into this frame of now consulting very widely? It was all based on this change in paradigm. So what we have witnessed is that there was a shift away from the heavy reliance on the state as the engine of development and growth in the 1960s and the 70s to market-based approach to development in the 80s and the 90s. And now the talk is more about knowledge as a fundamental ingredient within the context of development. In the advanced industrialized countries, and particularly in the area of health and other social policy areas, this is framed more as evidence-based policy making. How do we make sure that the content of an emerging policy or a policy that is coming is something that works and not something that will produce negative effects first before we will begin to. So things like pilot projects, things like trying to test policies in the lab. And in many advanced industrialized countries, what we have seen is the establishment of innovation labs, where scholars spend years trying to kind of work on a particular idea. Ideas became like capital. Before you put an idea into production, you are more or less sure that 80%, you are about 80% sure that this idea is more likely to work, as opposed to maybe just trying it and see whether it will work or not. And so some economists also begin to talk about, well, maybe the factors of production were not necessarily limited to land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur alone, but now we should also be talking about knowledge, because knowledge is also independent of these other factors as well. You could have money as the entrepreneur, you could have the labor, you could have your other, factors over there. If you don't have the knowledge to be able to push the production, that will be. The central question, therefore, is where does this leave higher institutions of learning, like the universities? Because for the most part, in our part of the world, what has happened is that think tanks emerged as alternative centers of knowledge production, like Imani and IEA and SIPA and others are actively engaged in some form of social research or economic research, and constantly they are engaging policymakers more than the universities are engaging policymakers. What is happening is that we have developed a system where people have become enthusiastic about the notion of knowledge-based economy or the knowledge-based social order, but there is a gap between research and policy making. And this is also for a good reason. There is what is called institutional path dependency. The bureaucrats have for long been used to seeing the public as a problem. And so now breaking through and allowing the public to come in with fresh ideas has become a problem. How do they manage that particular aspect of public policy making has become a key issue. And my research in this area is more about looking at the different actors, the mode of interaction among these actors. Is it competition? Is it collaboration? Is it cooperation? And how do they frame their pet policy solutions? So, for instance, ILO, World Bank, IMF, and all the other international institutions have some differences on specific policy areas. How do they frame these policies to the domestic audience? And also, I try to look at how the multiplicity or the increased number of policy actors now is shaping the terrain of public policy as a whole. Because, like I said, it used to be the case where the guys in the health ministry would just do the thing and then spill it over on the whole nation. Now, you have a situation where the World Bank speaks on the same issue, CIPA speaks on the same issue, Imani speaks on the same issue, IEA speaks on the same issue. Mm-hmm. Now, the question becomes, when all these organizations are promoting different pet ideas, how do we make sure that at the end of the day we get a consensus, we build a consensus? Can we find some commonality among the different perspectives that will work for the nation as a whole? And so my current research tends to kind of look at this mode of interaction among different policy actors and how policy actors could continually be brought to the table to enrich the experience of bureaucrats in ensuring that the content of public policy is for the public good. I would end here.
I think what I'd like to define knowledge, because knowledge is it purely information or has to be fact-based? What's the definition? Because I think that's one of the
contentious issues
as pertains to Africa.
Yes. I think that if you look at the genesis of this from the World Bank's report and then also in the academia, what has happened is that the definition itself is taken for granted. However, my own contextualized definition that I use in most of my papers is that it should be fact-based and it should be something that has more or less been tried and tested. It may be in another context. And so, for instance, in Canada, the way the Canadian government goes about something like this is to work on focus groups. So if the government is planning to, let's say, introduce a new policy, because the country is in different provinces, they try this policy in, let's say, New Brunswick or some area and see how people respond to it. And they may not change the policy entirely, but based on the feedback they get from the people, they may change certain aspects of the design. And public policy is a very complex thing, because policy is composed of the challenges, the goals, the instruments, and the design. And we may all agree that the goal of a particular policy is to enhance market efficiency. But to agree on the design could potentially become what will end killing that particular policy. So there are different dimensions to the same issue. For me, knowledge in this context is something that is fact-based. It must be based on evidence. I agree with those in the health sector who say this must be evidence-based research, the content of the policy. So, for instance, if we contextualize it with respect to Takrady and the oil find, for instance, there is huge literature on the oil curse theory, that almost all countries that have oil, in one way or the other, have had conflict. If they have not had conflict, then they have to be run by strong authoritarian systems. That oil systems that do not allow good governance, oil systems tend to breed conflict. So there is a huge literature out there. How do we in Ghana, having found oil, use the literature out there to design a system that makes sure that we avoid all the problems that, let's say, Iraq or Nigeria or any of the other countries with such resources. And so if we ignore this evidence that already exists, then clearly we are not making good use of knowledge. And in most cases, the reason we call research is because much of what we are searching is already there. We are only looking for it. We are actually not searching. We are just researching. Most of these have already been produced and are hiding in some archive somewhere. All it takes is to go and search. My experience looking in I actually have a paper coming in a Journal of Developing Societies, and it's on the politics of public policy, and it speaks about this silo breaking thing, the politics of public policy from closed circuit bureaucrats to citizen participation. And I talked about the shift in Ghanaian policy making, where gradually the elected officials are beginning to realize that people need to be consulted. But then I also raised a question about the fact that consultation also is marginalizing the unlettered and the rural folks, because at the end of the day, we still cannot. They may not have the knowledge to give us, but they may be able to speak about their problems. And then based on the knowledge of the educated, we can fashion out and design a solution to some of those problems. So there is a much more complicated problem, particularly in our context that we need to deal with simply.
Yeah, what I find kind of perplexing for me is that knowledge or information is often
used interchangeably.
Sorry.
Used interchangeably.
And also, it's a Western-based kind of parameters.
Okay.
So I think that we in Ghana and in Africa have a lot of work to do to reinterpret what we say knowledge is broader than that.
Yeah.
Then we have to really work very hard, and the think tanks have to really go deeper than looking at templates from the West and then kind of reinterpreting them. There's a lot of knowledge out there, even let's say in my profession, in
yes.
design world,
yeah.
out there which hasn't been captured.
Yes.
But it is out there.
Yes.
So when there's a project which wants to use, let's say, local materials, the tendency is, since we haven't captured it here, let's bring an expert who's captured it in, let's say, Venezuela.
Yes.
But what I keep telling people is that it's very hard to contextualize. It will take us much time than to, because eventually we have to capture ours, going to be relevant to
so
us.
You are talking about the ontology of the individual as far as knowledge is concerned. Where you stand determines the way you interpret the events. So, for instance, if you look at the notion of epistemic communities and policy networks, scholars in North America describe them as epistemic communities. Scholars in Europe describe them as policy networks. The same phenomena being described, being theorized from different perspectives. And they will defend it to death because that's what they see.
Yeah.
The question is, how do we contextualize these particular elements, and how there is a school of thought that believes that the existence of epistemic communities tend to delegitimize the state. There is another school of thought that says it enhances the competence of the state, because the state is already weak and it's not able to do much. So if the state develops an effective mechanism of interacting with these different communities, it will be more efficient in its policy making. The problem of many of the epistemic communities and the knowledge communities in Africa right now is that they come down to your point. We haven't been able to generate contextualized knowledge. And it's for a lot of reasons. Many of them are funded by external agencies that have rigid requirements on what they are looking for. I mean, this is not just about the epistemic communities or the think tanks alone. University faculties are facing the same problem, where you apply for funding for a particular research, you have a borderline, things that you can do and things that you cannot do. So the question is, where is academic freedom that you can